Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. I know we have people joining us from all parts of the world, and I'd really like to thank you for being with us today. My name is Stephen Gilchrist. I'm a Yamatji man from the Ingada language group of Northwest Western Australia, and I'm lecturer of Indigenous art here at the University of Sydney. I'm also Deputy Director of the Power Institute, and on behalf of the Power Institute, I'd really like to welcome you to the first of two panels that we have today. This first panel is called Indigenous Art Research, Respect and Relation. The second panel at 2 p.m. will be moderated by Wadandi Noongar curator Clotilde Bullen and is Indigenous art writing, writing art, writing culture, and will feature John Mundine, Cara Pinchbeck and Kimberly Moulton. So please join us for that at 2 p.m. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose customary lands I'm now on and the Power Institute stands. This place was named by the Gadigal for the Gadigal and because of the Gadigal, and I pay my deep respect to the ancestors of the past, present and future who have been keepers and couriers of this knowledge. I share a deep commitment to making visible and audible and tangible the Indigenous knowledge embedded and safeguarded through place. So today's event celebrates the winners of two awards that the Power Institute administered between 2017 and 2019. The Power Publications Dissertation Prize for the Indigenous Art Research and the Award for Indigenous Art Writing. Generously supported by the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund, these prizes really sought to recognise the best and exciting new critical work that's being produced by Indigenous art writers, as well as new research done by Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers in universities across Australia. So you can learn more about these two awards, and of course the winning entries can be found on the Power Institute's website. I'd also like to thank Carol McGregor for the use of her image, which recalls William Stanner's description, The Great Australian Silence, to the systematic erasure of Aboriginal histories, perspective stories from accounts of Australian history, and how can we, in culturally resonant ways, productively intervene into this. I'd also like to thank Bernard Key and Daniel Browning for their quote that we used as a challenge to speak into this silence. So in this first session, it's my great pleasure to introduce the three winners of the Power Publications Dissertation Prize. Mathieu Gallois, who won for his dissertation titled The Aboriginal Flag, Kate Massola, who won the prize in 2018 for her dissertation titled Living the Heritage, Curating the Past, a Study of Lyrigan Agency and Art in the Warman Community, and Jonathan Jones, who won in 2019 for his Murawegu, Following in the Footsteps of Our Ancestors. I know there's a lot of interest in your collective work, so thank you very much for joining us today and congratulations again. To begin this session, Indigenous Art Research and Respect and Relation, I thought I might briefly introduce you all and then invite you to share some aspect of your research with us for about 5 to 7 minutes. And I appreciate how difficult this is to, summarize a PhD in 7 minutes or less. But I know that our attendees are really eager to hear from you and can appreciate you contextualizing your work for us. So I'll introduce you all, then we can start our presentations. Dr. Mathieu Gallois is a practicing artist, architect, and as an architect, artist, and researcher, his work explores social and material alienation and displacement and their antipodes, place and belonging. Dr. Kate Massola works as a community arts and cultural developer, anthropologist, researcher, and arts administrator. Kate worked in the Warman community for 6 years, coordinated the gallery at the Warman Arts Centre, and conducting research, and is currently manager at the Glebe Community Development Project. Jonathan Jones is a member of the Wiradjuri and Gamilaroi Nations of Southeast Australia, and his work, he works across a range of mediums, from printmaking and drawing to installation. He creates site-specific installations and interventions into space that use light, shadow, repetition of shape, materiality to really explore Indigenous practices, relationships, and ideas. So thank you for joining us today. And perhaps I could begin with you, Matt. Would you mind sharing a little bit of your research with us?
Certainly, and thank you for your introduction. Hi, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the many traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting on today across Zoom Space Australia, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to thank the Power Institute for organising today's symposium. As per Stephen's introduction, my PhD research explored the Aboriginal flag's history and its many meanings. My examiners were Professor Lynette Russell, Professor Jacqueline Troy, and Professor Barry Judge. So I'm just going to share some slides with you as part of my talk. So you can is that visible?
Not yet.
Almost. Okay, and that's on the first slide. All right. So the following is a mini summary of my research. Created by Harold Thomas in 1971, the Aboriginal flag's power derives from its particular acute resolution, which has afforded it a multiplicity of meanings and associations. The symbolism of the flag describes the relationship of people to land, land to culture, and culture to identity. By association, the Aboriginal flag is an affirmation of pride. It claims and asserts Aboriginal land rights, advocates Indigenous self-determination, repudiates the insidious policies and culture of assimilation, and has come to symbolise the complex notion and claim of Indigenous sovereignty. The three main arguments of my thesis are: 1, the Aboriginal flag is a work of art. Since its creation, Thomas and other Aboriginal activists and artists have asserted that the flag is art. As Aboriginal art, the flag represents a continuum with traditional Aboriginal themes and aesthetic values. 2, the Aboriginal flag is a work of activist art. The actions of white and black Australians reveal that both groups understand the Aboriginal flag to be a powerful political symbol. And 3, the Aboriginal flag has influenced and shaped race relations and changed Australian society. I argue that the flag's most dynamic role has been as a catalyst for change in attitudes towards multiculturalism in mainstream Australian society. If you want to better understand these arguments, I encourage you to download the thesis from the University of Sydney's library via the link, which I will share with you all now in the chat space. So hopefully that's all gone through. Yeah. I forgot, I've got one more image, so just hang in there. Okay, before deciding to make the Aboriginal flag my research topic, I called Harold Thomas to sound him out. He welcomed my research proposal, in part because of our shared education in visual arts. He assumed correctly, though I would also understand the flag as a work of art. As an aside, it's interesting to note that Thomas is Australia's first Indigenous art graduate from a Western tertiary art institution. I was fortunate in that the central arguments of my thesis never differed significantly from those of my key Indigenous stakeholders. That said, Thomas did not like my final chapter titled "Who Owns the Aboriginal Flag?" And after reading it as part of the final thesis draft I sent him, he subsequently cut off all correspondence with me for over 18 months. My PhD research topic was initially much broader, and it was a practice-led research proposal. I wanted to explore activist art's potential to bring about social change to inform my own activist art and activist architectural practices. As part of my original thesis topic, I had planned to write a chapter on the Aboriginal flag as a an example of a successful work of activist art. However, predating my PhD, I did very consciously engage the Indigenous community of Wellington, New South Wales in Wiradjuri country. My Australian grandfather was the proprietor and conservative editor of Wellington's local newspaper, the Wellington Times, over a period of significant change in race relations, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. On a visit to Wellington around 2005, I had the good fortune to meet Joyce Williams, senior elder of the Wiradjuri people of Wellington. Joyce took the time to sit with me and to communicate the fuller meaning of myriad issues relating to Indigenous Australians. In collaboration with Joyce and the local Indigenous communities of Wellington between 2010 and 12, I created the Wiradjuri in Wellington Valley publication, which was a 50,000 word document in the form of a newspaper that was widely circulated within the community. I'll just uploading another link. So if any of you are interested, this is a link to that publication as well. In total, the Wellington Project represents an intimate history of Wellington's race relations, the processes of colonisation, and the community's tentative steps towards reconciliation. Across both my PhD research and the Wellington Project, I've understood my research areas to be Indigenous culture and communities, and the communities of settler Australians, and the meeting of those communities. In Wellington, this involved me researching my family's history and their role in Wellington's race relations, as recorded in the Wellington Times editorials, which my grandfather wrote. My time in Wellington involved deep learning and unlearning. I interviewed hundreds of people. I attended local Aboriginal meetings, such as local Aboriginal Land Council meetings. I conducted surveys. I spent a week in Wellington's Correctional Centre documenting inmates' life stories. I spent weeks in libraries unearthing archives, and I lived for brief periods with Aboriginal families, camping in their backyards or sleeping on their couches. Without that research foundation, I don't think I would have been able to write meaningfully about the Aboriginal flag. Concepts like colonisation, genocide, and land rights would have remained largely abstract. My knowledge would have been secondhand knowledge that did not relate to places and people I knew. The Wiradjuri in Wellington Valley records the following stories that particularly affected me. Joyce often spoke to me about her family struggles to survive out on manumission in the 1920s and 30s, how she was sent out to beg for food by her parents as a young girl. She told me many times, if it was not for the Chinese market gardeners who would extend food credit in return for future labour, her family would have perished. Joyce's three older siblings all died before they reached 12 years of age, having been denied basic rights in health, care, housing, sanitation, and food. Fully understood, Joyce's history is an indictment of the dominant white community's implicit role through their greed, silence, and inaction in the genocide that took place in Wellington in the 19th and 20th centuries. Joyce Williams just celebrated her 94th birthday a couple of days ago. So that's a lovely aside. Another story that deeply affected me was in 1957, Theodore May became the first Aboriginal person to own land under Australian law in Wellington, ending 140 years of total Wiradjuri land dispossession. May was only allowed to buy a small suburban block of land after being deemed to be of good character and suitably assimilated into the dominant white community, which had previously enforced systems of apartheid. I quote Joyce in the Wellington publication alongside May's original reproduction of May's land title deed, saying, "They stole our land and now we have to buy it back." Through Joyce and others, I came to understand the terms and conditions of Wellington's colonisation and the ongoing outrage Indigenous people feel in relation to the dispossession of their land. Most non-Aboriginal Australians, I believe, do not understand the personal insults and injuries Indigenous Australians like me suffer to secure land or a home. I, for one, is ignorant of the full dynamics at play. Halfway through the Wellington Project, as I walked down the main street one day, I became deeply uncomfortable in the realisation that Aboriginal culture in Wellington's public domain had been almost completely erased. This is to say that so total and effective was Wellington's colonisation, a tourist from Sydney or Europe visiting Wellington would be hard-pressed to witness any Wiradjuri culture walking through town, or to understand without being told that Wiradjuri people had occupied that country for tens of thousands of years. Many Australian towns and cities are the same. The above realisation laid the conceptual foundation for me to better understand the power and significance of the Aboriginal flag. In the first instances, the Aboriginal flag affirms in communities around Australia the presence of Indigenous Australians, their separate and independent culture, their rights and claims to land, and their claims of sovereignty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that. Kate, could I ask you to start your presentation, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Thank you very much for having me here to talk. Thank you for listening. I'm on Gadigal land at the moment, and I'd like to extend the acknowledgement of country to Gidja people from the East Kimberley, who I worked with for my thesis, and I want to express my thanks to them for sharing with me. Secondly, I want to identify myself as a non-Indigenous person working with First Nations people. My thesis research was based in the Warman community in Western Australia, where I had already been working at the Warman Arts Centre following the completion of a Masters of Art Curatorship in 2010. After spending time there and speaking with older people in the community, I applied to research the Warman Community Collection, which was then a body of about 340 objects. What I'd planned to do was discuss the artworks, discuss the lives of the artists, how artworks were used as pedagogic aids in the school, and study the information that was contained in them and collect their stories as an inventory for the community, all classic art historical methods. However, this all changed when a flood tore through the community in 2011 and the collection was taken off-site for conservation, and the community members were evacuated. When everyone returned, when the collection returned and when I returned, I still found, like I had in 2010 pre-flood, that art wasn't the primary tool for knowledge and cultural knowledge transfer. In fact, there were many other things going on. So although the flood forced me to rethink the role of the collection, indicators were already there that the objects in the collection were in a sort of state of pause. So I moved towards looking more broadly at art and creative practice and the everyday social world. So how did my research incorporate Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty? Methodologically, I used critical anthropological frameworks, one of those being recognizing my position as an outsider and not writing myself out of the story, like a disembodied reporter of another's experiences. That involves acknowledging the impact that I had. I use critical self-reflection as a decolonizing tool, deep listening and humility, constantly checking in with people that I'd understood correctly and represented them accurately. It was a slow process and one which I didn't control. What I ended up doing was highlighting Gidja-specific valuation and cultural processes over time. So in looking at the history of the Warman Community Collection, I found entanglements in shared spaces where people who were involved with the items had competing priorities and values. And it was vital, I saw, for me to draw out some Gidja voices. So for example, I found that the collection objects for the community had different value to different people, and they weren't valued singularly as having one role. Some items were relatively ephemeral and made as teaching aids, not objects intended to last, evidenced by their lack of attributions and in conversations and interviews I had with people. For some people, the collection represented the past and wasn't an expression of present teaching and learning. I also found that some objects encapsulated people who made them and who passed away and caused discomfort for others and explain avoidance and indecision in what to do with the objects in the future. In other cases, permission rights hadn't been established by family members for those passed away, and there were constraints on speaking for another's work. On the other hand, some people were really clear about some specific items and what their role was and their value was. On different occasions, people were invited to speak about the objects publicly, but chose not to. And this could have been for a myriad of reasons, but some of which no doubt were the adherence of culturally specific values. I also found that value for the object changes. And there is just as much, if not more importance placed on the process of making and using the objects as there were for holding and conserving and displaying the objects. I found that people had different memories of the objects. They had values that relate to their cultural significance, personal memories of making them and using them in the school and on country. And they also represented the people who made them. In tandem with this, I also sought to highlight the limitations to the art industry's methods of categorizing and valuing artworks. For example, fitting the collection items into significance assessment criteria and fund and grants for ongoing support led to the circulation of misinformation, such as misdating, preferencing older works, which reinforce static views of Aboriginal culture, and fast decision-making processes that didn't suit some people in the community, especially when sort of cultural processes hadn't been enacted. I found altogether that these requirements can actually disable instead of facilitating the slow agentive decision-making that is often needed when permission rights haven't been resolved. Just have a sip of water. So I guess to summarize, the gauge of value creation processes I found were time-rich processes of decision-making, understanding that some people will not speak about or use another objects or story. And it's necessary for outsiders like myself to leave time and space for people to value and revalue objects and potentially make new ones, which are no less significant than old ones. My findings really urge the integration of relatively autonomous cultures and Indigenous value creation processes into government and institutional frameworks. More time and resources need to be given on the ground to enable source communities to have process to determine the future for their collections. And this may mean that outsiders need to sit back and wait or buy time by extending deadlines. Incorporating Indigenous-led processes and methodologies destabilises biases and allows Indigenous worldviews, practices and experiences to come out. And I think that this is a really important shift in the greater field of research and in Australia coming to terms with its colonising past. That's all, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kate, for that. And Jonathan, could I ask you to begin your presentation, please? Thanks so much.
Honorable Stephen, Dira Domarang Wajilang, Yuwendi Jonathan Jones, Palado Redrig, Milroy, Bull Gibia, Natun Ninjamara Mangalang Nurambangu, Eurobu Garigobo, Mangalang. Thanks for the opportunity to talk today. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone talking today and also everyone for joining in. I was really lucky to undertake my research and think about, I guess, a whole bunch of issues in relation, in particular, to the southeast. And when I sort of say the southeast, I'm sort of referring to that sort of, I guess, what we call today that sort of Murray-Darling block with the sort of coastal areas. And I guess in many ways, I was interested in my research filling in a gap that was looking or trying to place Southeast artists and have a sense of history and art history around the work we do, because for the most part our history has been you know, erased, ignored, or sort of packaged up you know, in very odd ways, you know, even sort of labeling people as urban artists often sort of disguises our cultural sort of currencies and traditions. So my research was really trying to think about an art history for this region, and in particular, an art history that related to men's work as a culturally sort of appropriate way of me working as an Aboriginal man. So my work sort of centered around that idea, and I sort of stepped into the research area. In some ways, as Aboriginal people, I guess we have to go into this research space. It's not a comfortable space for us. It's a space that's sort of been designed to block us in so many ways, and privilege others. And so taking a step into that space is difficult and really challenging, and I sort of applaud any Aboriginal person who undertakes that research. And I have to acknowledge that I had really good support around me. I studied at UTS, and there's an amazing team there, and I need to acknowledge everyone there, but in particular, obviously, through my practice, I sort of set up a support group of elders, advisors, who supported me through this project. And so the project was really trying to think about, and I should sort of reverse that a little bit too. I guess I'd also sort of say that, you know, this research space is really difficult because it does present us as the problem, like, what's your research problem? You know, and sorry, my community doesn't have a problem. That problem is how we're represented. So it's a really difficult position to come from, that research avenue where you have to have a research problem that you need to solve. And so even at that very early stage, we need to start untangling what research means for us as Aboriginal people. And the process was really thinking about what are the extraordinary things that we have in this region. And when I started looking in particular at men's work right across different eras, different ages, different artists, the process of working with line became a really strong element. You know, that process of carving wood, and putting line marks on it, or creating possum skin cloaks and designing them with really significant line marks, ceremonial groundworks. But then how they then started to translate into contemporary artists was really significant. And so the fact that we could actually look across the board and see that, you know, artists have not let go of working with lines. And it's so for me, that became, I guess, the vehicle for unpacking a really strong tradition within this region. And so then the process for me was really then, how do I tell this enormous story from this region? Because there are some really fantastic stories, and thankfully, you know, I was able to draw on some of the cultural strengths that we have. And so one of the kind of ideas that that research leans on is really thinking about a kinship system that we have in the Southeast, which binds us all together, which is really, you know, 4 pairs of generations cycling. So the idea was simply to break down the story into sort of, I guess, if you like, pre-contact, contact, mission days, and contemporary artists. So there's four generations, and then two representatives within each of those generations. And so that really provided the kind of framework for building out the research process, which was a really exciting way of working, and being able to zoom in on specific people and specific mediums to tell that story. However, my research sort of really kind of struggled, because a key area for me to develop was actually also thinking about the methodology and the process. And I have to acknowledge the three sort of key elders that sort of was sat over my research process was Uncle Michael McDaniel from UTS, Annie Joy, Wanda Murphy, and Uncle Stan Grant Sr. And it's Uncle Stan who really has been a sort of key collaborator with me on a number of projects. And so together, Uncle and I sort of sat down and devised a what we call Radri Yinjamara Gulbana. So Radri, respectful knowledge. And so this idea is how do we work respectfully with our knowledge? And we, from that process, we started to develop a methodology. So a Radri methodology and a way of working that was appropriate for me as a Radri person, going out and working with other communities across the Southeast. And so that was a really extraordinary process to work with him, work with language and develop that story. And that process, and it's you know, there's really just sort of 7 key ways of thinking. And so each of them, Uncle Stan and sat down and crafted statements about in language, and then we sort of translated them back into English about how to be a respectful researcher, essentially. And that's something that we're really proud of, that we're hoping can at least provide a bit of a foothold or a platform for the next generations of Radri researchers going forward. But just really quickly, they were obviously to talk straight, listen deeply and act respectfully. The responsibility of Radri researchers to grow knowledge, to share our knowledge and respect our knowledge. We need to ensure that we care for our community through our research processes. We need to understand ourselves and understand our position within the community and what those and what that means, and that might have limitations in terms of research. We also need to encourage Radri self-determination in all the work we do. We need to build Radri knowledge systems. And then finally, we need to look after country. So there are kind of our sort of key 7 points of how respectful knowledge and ways of working need to occur. And so from that basis, we then developed the project, and the project resulted in 2 key outcomes, obviously the thesis, but we were really committed to developing a major exhibition that sort of highlighted the research and all the programs that came off that, and that research. And so the exhibition and the programs, I was really lucky to work with the Art Gallery of New South Wales and develop those programs. But that was really the key I guess, platform for community to sort of jump in and actually kind of engage with that research because of, you know, we need to acknowledge the limitations of a PhD and a thesis sitting on a shelf and what that does. So yeah, I might leave it there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. I just thought I might start with a question about you know, one of the big questions that I think all of your work engages with, and that is, what is this question of art and who gets to define it? I think, and you know, can it be redefined? Can it be restoried in some different ways to better represent Indigenous philosophies of value? I know, Matt, your work dealt with the question of the flag that is both, you know, singular and plural, and you know, Jonathan, your work was really about support or amplifying the work of artists and objects from the Southeast that have been underrepresented. And, you know, Kate, your work was real about how art can be so much more than art. And I was just wondering how you felt if your work pushed at the limits of what this word art is, and if you think there's productive value in thinking beyond the idea that Indigenous art exceeds the idea of Indigenous art. Kate, maybe I could start with you.
Sure. I think it definitely goes beyond the object, and I think that's one of the things that I was trying to argue in the thesis, that it gets incorporated in every aspect of life, and it's not just the result of an object. And then that role of the object changes and new objects are made. And I think, yeah, it's sort of boundless.
Hmm. And I mean, we're often told that, you know, there's no word for an Indigenous word for the word art, but really the English word for art really falls short of capturing, you know, all of the socio-ceremonial, environmental, intellectual values that is in this word kind of art. And yeah, Jonathan, I was wondering if you wanted to think about that, because you were looking specifically at an object that hasn't been identified as art, that it was, classified as artifact in your work with shields.
Yeah, I guess I was quite interested in that process, and I think one of the things that we did that we were really excited about was mending some of those bridges, because there has been such division to where we belong and where the things we make belong, and that's often obviously been out of our hands. So that process of actually being able to sit back and put an unknown shield next to a work by Rico Rennie and say, well, what are the conversations here? What are the activation points? And I think they're really important conversations to be had. And as you alluded to, the thing that became, I guess, more evident, and I need to acknowledge Carol Cooper, who's an extraordinary researcher in this area and has been saying for a long time that we all need to look much closely at these shields and material from the Southeast that mainly sits in museums and doesn't get a look in. But once we started looking at those objects and actually looking at them as artworks, we could see the individual marks of individual artists. So that process was really exciting, and it was almost a tipping point when we were thinking, do we just, does this research just start looking at the shields, because there is so much work to be done in going through those archives and attributing shields and objects to specific makers. We were really lucky that we were able to do that. So definitely, these are not art or makers producing, quaint diamond designs that no one can read or interpret. These are very specific designs. These are very specific ways of making that mark that we can unpack to the point where we've attributed artists to unknown objects that are sitting in museum collections. So I think in that context, we're definitely able to sort of use that Aboriginal lens for unpacking and decolonizing those collections, which most people would tell you isn't possible in the Southeast. The Southeast, we're all being told that, the Southeast is so damaged, that we were so disrupted, that our connections were broken, that there are no research avenues here. And in many ways, using that art lens was able to reopen and reactivate those collections, which I think was really important.
And Matt, did you your thesis really attacked this question about, is the Aboriginal flag art?
Yeah, most definitely. And it was the flag's a great vehicle for exploring different understandings of how art is understood. Harold Thomas has, as I mentioned, he's a graduate from a Western art school or institution. And so he really had a foot in both cultures. And yeah, the flag's a great way to explore the differences of how those cultural objects operate in those different communities and how they overlap.
And Jonathan, I was wondering if I could ask you, do you think that art historical research or PhD programs could be more supportive of nurturing Indigenous language revitalization? I think, your research really, I guess, shows that language is inside methodology and methodology is inside language. And, could there be, a language requirement, for example, for people entering PhD programs on Indigenous art? And I was just wondering, what your thoughts are on that. And I know, Kate, you included a glossary. It was very important to have Gidja language in your thesis as well. But maybe Jonathan?
Yeah, look, I think it is maybe not so. It's hard, isn't it? I think unpacking the deeper meanings. So for instance, I'm not the first person to look at shields in museum collections. But when I started looking at them, I started recognizing hands. I started recognizing shields from old photos. I started recognizing connections between a shield in this museum and one in another museum. And I spoke to Uncle Stan. I was like, Uncle, what's this about? Like, I'm not new. I'm not doing anything special. What's happening? And he said, this is Yinjamara. And so Yinjamara is our word for respect. And he said, you are showing those shields respect. And the process of the way I worked with them was that I would actually sit with each shield for at least 3 or 4 hours drawing them, and because photographs just don't work. I wasn't doing anything weird. I just was like, I just need to draw them so I can understand the designs that are on them, because every time you take a photo of a brown wooden shield, you just see the outline. It's really difficult to get all the intricacies. So I sat down 4 hours with each shield just drawing the designs. And Yinjamara actually means to go slow, to be slow with something, to spend time with it, to actually show it some respect. And the second I started doing that, I started seeing connections. So I think just understanding that different mindset around how to treat data and how to treat information and those sort of ideas is reshifting that Indigenous lens is really important. And language is, language is definitely one of the keys that we use to sort of, I guess, reactivate our Indigenous lens.
Okay, did you also want to?
I don't have much more to add on top of what Jonathan said, except just that importance of language, being able to articulate very specific things that are specific to a group of people. It's like you need language links everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we really need to be pushing for, to have much more localized and specific art histories. That is really what we need to raise the temperature on. I was wondering if I could ask you about, you were working between disciplines, between anthropology and art history, and there's been a long hostility between these two disciplines. And I was just wondering how you navigated this disciplinary binary. And, I think you mentioned the tools that you did use, and maybe think about the tools that you threw away. And, what was the matter that mattered for the Warman community as well?
That's a good question. I think the most important one was just to let go and be led, which I don't know, probably falls more into anthropological frames than art historical frames. I did go in with a mindset, having an art history background of what I was going to do, and the flood helped me go, no, you need to let go, and you just need to listen to people and see where it takes you. Yeah.
Matt, did you want to add anything about thinking about interdisciplinarity in your approach?
Well, your original question was more about art history and anthropology. And so my background is more in art history and art practice. So it's a little bit different. I did find, I actually changed supervisors. So my first supervisor, as I explained earlier, I was doing a practice-based PhD. And then when I started exploring the Aboriginal flag, I remember I asked, when you're doing a PhD, as a lot of you would know, you can have a librarian assigned to help you do some research. And so I had this wonderful fellow from University of New South Wales called Wolf, who I asked him to find, I was going to write a chapter on the Aboriginal flag, and I asked him to find what he could in terms of the library's extensive databases. And there was really very, very little that had ever been written about the Aboriginal flag. And so with that realization, my supervisor at the time really encouraged me over months and months to change my topic and say, look, he was very keen for me to write about the Aboriginal flag, because he could see how it was an area that had been completely ignored or under-researched. And in terms of that important contribution that you need to make your PhD of new knowledge, it ticked all the boxes. So it took me a while. You know, I hesitated for a long time because, as I said, I had been initially as practice-based and I was wanting to inform my practice, and I had hesitancies about working in Indigenous field, and also hesitancies about just being able to pull it off. Luckily, I had that Wellington Project, which is an incredible foundation. But in that process, still with that first researcher at the time, and within the culture of that institution, there was a big emphasis on, you know, quoting European theorists. And so Jacques Rancière was, you know, this is like 5 or 6, 7 years ago. He was like the hot French theorist at the time. And that particular supervisor put, you know, he was like, you have to refer to Rancière, and that's the theorist that is current at the moment, etc. I had come with already a very hefty degree of skepticism in terms of relying on theory, in terms of my own art practice. I could see I had learned the limitations through my own art making. And an important realization in my research process was just realizing Rancière had never really thought about the particular circumstances of Indigenous Australians. So one of Rancière's key arguments is there's no relationship between cultural practice and art activism. And in Indigenous practice, something like the Bark Petition brings those two together, and the Aboriginal flag, in a way that is so completely unambiguous that it completely laid waste to Rancière's argument. And so it's quite a liberating moment just to, you know, like, so I bring in Rancière and I'm just like, this is completely irrelevant. And, you know, I was able to, you know, and from those contacts in Wellington and then all the other people I interviewed for the PhD, it was really oral histories and Indigenous academics that were the basis of my research.
And maybe, Jonathan, I could ask you, I mean, did you have any kind of hesitancy or feel pressured to declare some kind of disciplinary allegiance in your thesis? I think, and maybe, you know, do you see that anxiety is because you don't want to, you know, replicate, you don't want to endorse kind of Western theoretical frameworks, but that this anxiety could also be an opportunity to kind of foreground new or resurface old existing methodologies?
Yeah, I think I keep falling back on this idea that Lynn Honors, that the late Yorta Yorta artist who, and, you know, just an amazing sort of leader for this region in particular, he sort of said that he comes from the bowerbird school of art. And I love bowerbirds, and they make a very beautiful nest out of fragments. They pull together fragments of knowledge and ideas, and they create these extraordinary nests. And that's what he was referring to. And I think in the Southeast, we are in that position where we, you know, we have had a whole bunch of things disrupted, and it is up to us to sort of go through that process of finding those pieces. And, you know, that can be, and I think we need to work with everyone, anything and anywhere to recreate this nest, and we need to do that, and we shouldn't be beholden to that. And I do think that's why people from the Southeast, you know, we are in such an extraordinary position because we are able to do all these things. You know, we can sit at this juncture point and draw on a whole range of stories and processes, places, and ideas, and come up with a much stronger platform to work from. So I you know, I think again it's about reframing that and seeing it as a really one of our strengths that we come from. And, you know, people like Lynn Honors were very clear that that's the position we are coming from here in the Southeast. And so I really maintain that.
I think, yeah, you've spoken really beautifully about this collective we of the Southwest, this difficult we, but in all of your work, the panelists, you know, you've worked with Aboriginal communities, but writing a PhD is quite a kind of individual process. But I was just wondering how you, you know, committed yourself to amplifying, you know, communities in your practices. I think this is a question that we've had in the chat about how do you work with and on behalf of communities?
Are you asking me in particular, or?
Oh, I'm asking, yeah, all the panel, but yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go? I can go if you want. So I guess for me it is really complex because it's you're within but also sort of working really closely with people. And I guess as Aboriginal people we do this every day, you know. So it's often hard to put a label on how we live and breathe. But the process of working with people. You know, I do think there's some really interesting slippages in terms of the research juncture and how that doesn't really connect. And so in particular, one example is, you know, if we were working working and found a shield. So, you know, you're looking at a shield in collections, you somehow start piecing together the information about who the maker was, you somehow piece together that it's coming from this community, you somehow get these little threads that all start feeding it together. Next minute, you're knee deep in someone's ancestor and trying to research that ancestor without their permission. But you didn't know that that was their ancestor before, so how could you get that permission? So you then end up working really retrospectively. And for me, I think that has been one of the interesting processes of being an Aboriginal researcher is, you know, because traditionally we go to our elders for answers. And for me, it was really complex going to my elders and saying, well, I've got all this knowledge now. Can you check it? There's also a bit of a disruption and how you flow that information. And I guess too, you know, I guess when I do these talks, I'm always thinking of young researchers, young Aboriginal researchers. And so I guess it's a little bit of a like, yeah, how do we come to terms with that as Aboriginal researchers? We need to sort of make sure that we have those right elders around us that can support that, the knowledge reversing and coming back up the line instead of it coming down. And so that process of collaboration for me was really interesting. And I guess a complex one in terms of your question, probably the stranger sort of end of it.
Yeah. And I mean, this might be a good time to answer Katina Davidson's question about thinking about, yeah, there's so many possibilities for Indigenous art research, and I think that we need to think about, well, what are the conditions of possibility for Indigenous research and Indigenous researchers? You know, what systems need to change? You know, what systems need to be broken down? And, you know, perhaps these are practical concerns. And Katina's asked about the jumping through hoops to get ethics approvals for Indigenous peoples, for autoethnographic research practices and things like that. You know, the PhD is one instrument to encode knowledge, but there are, of course, others. I'm hearing that you're thinking about, well, what comes next? You know, what is the future for Indigenous researchers in universities? Sorry, maybe that's you again, but the others, because I think you both still work in and around universities.
Yeah, I guess from what I saw, there was some real issues in relation to, you know, there are a whole bunch of impediments. As I said, I feel like we need to reorganize this idea of a research problem. I find that just really difficult to stomach, that as Aboriginal people, we somehow have to approach it from that deficit angle again. And that knowledge is generated through a problem. I don't believe that's the way the world should work. I think that's such a Western way of thinking. And all the way to the ICIP issues. You know what I mean? I felt, apparently I was the first person to put an ICIP clause in my PhD. And I have to say that it was only because of an extraordinary cohort at UTS, like, you know, Larissa Barrent and Michael, you know, that were able to push that through and just to say, no, this is where we need to be right now. So there's all of those kind of restraints that sort of sit within the institution. And I have to admit, my ethics got rejected twice, which I think is really interesting. Yeah, that we have to, you know, that we're not allowed to say that we're going to have cups of tea with our elders and talk about research at their house. Somehow that's a problem. which is just such a joke, because we know that that's not how research happens, and we know that's not how we work with community in respectful ways. So there does need to be some very big gears changing in the system to support, you know, Aboriginal knowledge coming through.
So yeah, no, thank you so much. Matt or Catherine? Kate?
Do you want to go first, Matt?
You go ahead, Kate. I'm not sure if I don't know if I've got much to add on that one.
I guess I can reiterate what I said in my presentation about being a non-Indigenous person, being conscious and being really critical of my role and who I am and what am I doing there, and being aware of how I behave and being open to learning new things. I guess that's how I have worked in community in the past, and how I continue to work with people. That's with everyone, anywhere that I work. Yeah, I think self-reflection and listening and humility are great tools. Yeah,
absolutely. Yep. And you know, you've shared a little bit about all of you shared you know, what you did, and I was just wondering what the research process did for you. You know, it probably gave you a lot of sleepless nights, but you know, what did it give to you personally at the end?
Haven't heard from you, Matthew.
Yeah, I can start on this one. Look, before I went to Wellington, I had a couple of degrees already. I had I think, a pretty good education in Australia in some ways, but I really felt I didn't understand the experience and histories of Indigenous Australians. And so it was a self-initiated project for me to head out to Wellington, and I had the good fortune of having those family links and being able to engage a community and say, you know, my ancestors lived here, and my grandfather played a really key role, as he was a very prominent conservative voice, a very vocal voice in the community, and there was these records, 21 years of editorials for me to pore over. So it's definitely been, I feel more comfortable now in terms of having both done the Wellington Project and written about the Aboriginal flag, that I have a better understanding of Indigenous Australians, their histories, their experience. So
thank you. Kate?
What the PhD did for me, I think it just built some amazing relationships that I continue with people today, and they're really meaningful to me. I think that's the primary thing that I got out of it, as well as, having that experience and the time to do that was awesome.
Great, thank you. And Jonathan, maybe we could end with you.
I'm trying to figure out if I should end in a good note or a bad note, but I guess I need to be. I guess I need to be truthful and say, like, there was a big part of this research to say you need to take us seriously. You need to, getting this stupid set of letters next to your name would mean that I don't get spoken down to at conferences. Would mean that Aboriginal people have a place. Would mean our stories mattered. I'm not sure that's happened yet, and I sometimes wonder that is this the right avenue? So I'm not sure if it was a failed project. And I'm really sorry to say that to any young Aboriginal researchers listening, but we need to work out what's our game plan, and how can we make what we do meaningful, because we need to change. We need to change the current situation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for the three panelists today. I'm really appreciate your time and sharing your research with us. And I hope that people can join us again at 2 p.m. To listen to our next panel for the Disruption Symposium. So thank you very much for Matt, Kate, and Jonathan. Thank you.